Sego, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the show and you want to give support to the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. And if you do so, we'll provide you some exclusive content and some things that others aren't going to get when you get it. So support us by going to Patreon. Yahweh.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sego, and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane, I'm your host. And look, I'm not sure how this show is going to go. I'm going to tell you right now. This is a tough one. Look, there's a lot of conversation right now because of the murders that took place in Atlanta, Georgia, and the white man shooting and murdering a bunch of Asian women in particular. And so there's a lot of conversation about anti-Asian sentiments that exist, and I've talked on this program about racism quite a bit, and I'm going to talk about it some more today. But I think we need to shift the narrative a little bit, because clearly as we talk about what racist behavior is or isn't and that kind of thing, the one thing is clear is that what's behind much of this is this idea of white supremacy. But for us, it's not just enough to call it out. It's what are we prepared to do to develop an anti-racism position? How do we promote not just to call out racism or to try to encourage people not to be racist, but how do we develop even the mindset to oppose racism, to be anti-racist, because not being a racist and being anti-racist is not the same thing. Because there are plenty of people who may not be racist, but they don't do anything to stop racism. And I think we all have to be somewhat activists, I guess, in this regard. But much of this starts at home, because look, we all have racial bias, and racial bias is a little bit different than overt racism. I've said it before on the program, so let me say it again. Racism is about power. It's about supremacy. It's about the belief that because of your race, you view yourself superior to a person of another race. I mean, that's essentially what racism is. And of course, racism is also systemic. And by systemic, it means the institutions that we all interact with, whether it's government, whether it's, media, whether it's, whatever kind of commerce there is out there, that those institutions have a racial bias in terms of how they treat people. And certainly we see that in terms of the justice system and how police interact with people of color and that kind of stuff. But also because industry and so when we talk about entertainment or even marketing and that kind of stuff, there's a certain level of marketing of racial bias. And frankly, since white men basically built the systems that are still in practice today, this is how this idea of racism is systemic. So how do we stop that? I mean, how do we combat things like the sexualization of marginalized women, for instance? So whether we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women or what we've seen take place this past week with this gunman shooting, and I'm going to be clear here. I haven't seen anything that suggests that these women were sex workers. And I know that becomes another conversation. they were massage parlors. And we can get into a whole discussion on that, I guess, but I'd rather not have that discussion. But regardless, these these women were targeted by these establishments were targeted by them. They weren't brothels. I mean, they were massage parlors. And the idea that this guy, killed these women, and then goes on to say that it wasn't racially motivated, that it was motivated by his sex addiction. Well, therein lies part of the problem. This idea of white male, dominance, and again, this notion of white supremacy, it suggests to white men that their fetishizing of other people and of women of other cultures is perfectly acceptable. I mean, it's part of the reason. It's part of the reason that missing and murdered Indigenous women is a thing. Most of it is tied to this notion of male dominance, white male dominance. So how do we address this? I mean, and look, we know that many cultures, and Native culture is certainly among them, that we do have a preference, right? I mean, we as parents or even as grandparents, we hope that our children, our grandchildren will marry Native. I mean, we hope that. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time. And frankly, it can't happen all the time. And the reason it can't happen all the time is because our population is very, very marginalized. We're a small population. And oftentimes we live in areas that we're related to so many of the people that we live next to. So in the absence of having a lot of networking from different Native territories together, that pool of candidates for our children and our grandchildren to marry or intermarry with and that kind of stuff becomes slim. Now, having said all that, having acknowledged that we may have a preference, and look, Italian families have preferences, Black families have preferences, Asian families have preferences. And we get that. I mean, and of course, when I said Italian families, but I would say white families. But even within those what is considered the white people, Irish and Italians and Polish, and there's a lot of preferences that they have within because of culture and ethnicity within their racial designation, I guess. So look, that exists. That doesn't mean that we have to hate other people. Even if we have preferences about who our friends are and where we live and or where we choose to live, that doesn't mean we need to hate other people. And it doesn't mean we need to look down upon other people. I mean, just because you have a preference doesn't mean that you have to dismiss or feel a sense of superiority. A preference is not the same thing as supremacy. So how do we address this? Well, look, we know that we confront racist comments, and there's so much in our daily lives that we experience when it comes to seeing racism play out. Look, not just the shows that we watch on television or on our phone or what we see in the movie theater, but again, in every marketing campaign, every ad that we see, on a billboard or, again, on a television or in a magazine, we get shaped by that. So how do we prevent that? Well, first off, it does come down to recognizing what is the creation of racial stereotypes, but also not allowing ourselves to become shaped by somebody else's racial bias. And look, I'm going to say it again. There is a difference between overt racism or racism in the sense of superiority inferiority dynamics, and prejudice and discrimination. The idea of prejudice, which on its face, the idea that you may prejudge a people based on their appearance, which is really where racism gets its start. That judgment, the problem with it is that judgment can also become just a good versus evil thing. So we have to, even as we're judging our circumstances and we're evaluating people, it doesn't. We no longer should have to do this based on this whole fight or flight notion, that is almost animalistic, I guess. We don't need to perceive people as a threat, even if they don't fit our preference model. And I think that's something that we really need to teach our children this. And we need to address this idea of anti-racism. And we need to look, we're guilty of it too. Native people are guilty of it too. Don't get me wrong. Like I said, we have our preferences. But look, I've experienced all of the jokes, the off-color jokes and that kind of stuff, our whole lives. I mean, and the crazy part is we buy into this notion of, even as we talk about race mixing, there's a bias that people who are part white, and I'm included in that, are not we're not looked at the same as if our people are part black. And so we buy into that stuff. We don't accept, look, again, regardless of our preferences, we know that our families are going to intermingle, and we're going to have biracial families. And we cannot allow hate and this our own discriminatory practices to dominate our landscape. And I know it's tough because look, we get faced with blood quantum issues. Even the whole matrilineal thing has taken a turn that is so different. So, I mean, we will acknowledge that if a person's mother is Native, then they're Native. But if their father's Native, they're what? And if their mother isn't. So there are things that we've allowed to creep into our systems that create the bias, that create the prejudice and the discrimination. And I'll tell you, it's a fine line between that racial bias, that discrimination and prejudice, to where we start imposing the same racism dynamic, where we start adopting a preference. We almost promote the idea of white supremacy. So this is the challenge. And I know this is a tough show because I'm not even sure how to address this stuff. But I know as I watch the news this week, and look, every program on NPR and on television is addressing Asian hate, as if it didn't exist the week before last. This bias, and look, and it cuts both ways. I mean, there are black people who might patronize a business that is run by a different ethnic group. So whether it's white or Asian or Hindu or whatever, however you want to label people, I guess. And we see it all the time, because there are certain businesses that have that may be dominated by one culture or another. But I know black people have had terrible experiences with every one of those institutions. I'm not saying every experience has been terrible, but and frankly, as Native people, we've experienced it too. And of course, ours gets it doesn't get talked about as much because we're such a small population. But the idea of being profiled in a department store, or even in a grocery store, it happens all the time. But one of the places that we have to begin to address this issue is to check our own selves. We need to be anti-racist if we expect others to be. Now, this isn't about trying to create, homogenism or kumbaya moments, in terms of racial equity, so to speak. Look, our circumstance is a little unique because we do have distinct places that are native territories. I don't mean just I'm not talking about native neighborhoods. I'm not talking about Chinatown or a predominantly black community. We don't run the risk of gentrification from native territory. We do when we're living in the other environments. So our circumstance is a little different. And our distinction as a people is not just about the mosaic, American mosaic. Much of what we fight for is not just about civil rights under the U.S., political system and, a legal system and, and all of that. Much of what we're fighting for is our distinction. Now, that line between us trying to fight for our distinction and rejecting other ethnicities, that's complicated. I mean, especially since our patronage is going to come from the outside. Much of the employment that we rely on for our businesses, whether it's private sector, whether it's nation businesses, they do rely on not just on the people from a given territory. We may have other native people from other territories coming in. Well, how do we make sure that we treat other native people fairly in a given community? Look, I'm not Seneca, and I live in Seneca territory. So I guess to some extent I'm pitching this as a plea for me to be treated fairly, which I am. But that's not necessarily going to be the case for people who are not native. So again, how do we treat this? I mean, look, we know we have a drug problem here on territory. We have drug problems in all of our territories. Most of those drugs come from the outside. But who's bringing them in? And are we automatically going to assume that it's, that the drug dealers are white or black? And so do we, start to make assumptions about, who are the bad guys? And again, do we have native people who are bringing the stuff in? I mean, for the most part, it may not be native people, but certainly we're not producers. So it is complicated. But as I see the tensions, look, as native people, we know how we are treated by much of the dominant cultures around us. And look, and some of that treatment can come at the hands of black people. I mean, I saw a whole rant just the other day about how wrong it was that I don't know what the number is. Somebody's told me, I think $30 billion or something like that is coming into Indian country as a part of the stimulus package. I saw a black man just going off about how wrong it is that native people are getting this special preference. I mean, that'd be like me, railing against reparations for, African descendants of slaves or American descendants of slaves or whatever else. I mean, and I just think there's inappropriateness there. And I don't know if that $30 billion is real and how much of it's going to be tied up into the bureaucracies that the United States creates on every program that comes into native territory. I understand the bulk of that has to do with health care. And you know what? Health care is a promise, an unkept promise by the federal government. And in fact, not only is it unkept by the federal government, it's actually been dished down to be a state problem. So there's a lot of problems with the relationship and the unkept promises. And we can talk about treaties if we want, but the bottom line is these are all parts of the failings of the so-called trust responsibility that the federal government claimed that they would pick up as a result of some of these cessions of land. So again, our situation is a little bit different. But when I hear that kind of racist tropes, and the dialogue that's coming out of other marginalized people because they're viewing us as somehow the beneficiaries of something that they're not getting. This kind of just, it feeds the division. And let's be honest here. The idea of creating tensions amongst marginalized people is a bit of a strategy by the dominant culture around us. I mean, and we see this, it plays out in movies, it plays out in, on television, and as much as you will see that, especially, again, I got to point to black people, because one of the things about black people is they are more marginalized in much of the same way that Native people are. But the difference that black people have, and again, they've got something unique that, that we don't. They have buying power. I'm not saying Native people don't have any buying power, but we are not significant purchasers of American products, of products. We're a small population. But the wealth that exists amongst black people, and even people who are not necessarily wealthy, the spending habits of black people, they have a huge amount of clout associated with their buying power. But in spite of that, they're still mistreated in many of these these businesses. So whether it's retail or whether it's a service business, whether it's nail salons or whether it's whatever it is, I mean, there's a real scrutiny that black people experience. And so we, part of the whole thing is to use whatever clout we have. So in Native people, we got to figure out, how is that we can combat racism and not feed racism. And it's the same thing that every group. So if you're an Asian population, how do you make sure that you're not feeding racism? If you're a black family or a black community, how to make sure that you're not feeding racism? I don't mean feeding the victimization. I mean, but how do you not create more tensions amongst other marginalized people? And look, it isn't just about all of us against white people, but make no mistake about it. The divisions that have been sown in our territories and our communities between other marginalized people are deep. And they're real. And we can address that without addressing the white supremacy. So, I mean, I guess what I'm suggesting in this program is trying to develop a strategy amongst marginalized people that we do what we can to be the anti-racists. And that we certainly don't feed into the divisions that have been promoted amongst our people. And they have been. So make no mistake about that. But look, if you're a black man and you hear this guy on the internet railing against Native people getting, a stimulus check, then check them. I mean, take it on in your own community. And I'm saying the same thing about Native people. We cannot just join in on bashing another race or ethnicity that's not ours. We have to look. We understand that as Native people, we are under a certain amount of maybe assault isn't the right word, but we're in a constant battle for our own survival on our territories, but that doesn't, and I know that's a terrible metaphor in this instance, I guess. We don't need to view everybody as the enemy. And that's not to say that we need to welcome everybody who claims to be an ally, into our household. But we have to do more to combat this notion of hate, especially a hate that we're going to somehow only attribute to what we visually see as somebody that's different than us. I mean, we've got to care more. And I know this sounds, trite, I guess. But we cannot be a part of the racial divides. Even as we're trying to assert our distinction, we shouldn't do it at the cost of somebody else. So as I see, again, news program after news program after news program address, the crimes against Asian people. That's the flavor of the day this week. And I don't want to say it to minimize the horror of what took place, by this mass murderer. But this didn't just happen this week. And we do have to recognize that white supremacy has played such a huge role in not only the interaction that all of us have with the dominant culture, with the white culture, but we've let it creep into our conversations. And that might be, I mean, man, that might be the worst part of it. The idea that even as we have a shared common struggle with other marginalized people, and that we can still hate on them. And there's no benefit to it. I mean, there's nothing that we don't prosper, and keeping, I mean, as Native people, we certainly don't have the power to keep anybody down. We're the most marginalized people in the United States and Canada. So we don't have the power to keep another people down, but we do have the power to let the hate grow. So I guess, and I know this, like I said, I promised this was going to be a tough show, and it is, because I'm struggling with this stuff. And look, for those of you who check out this podcast, I welcome your comments and your criticism, because this is something that I'm struggling with as well. I'm not struggling with it, because I want to hate on anybody, but I'm struggling wrapping my hands around it. But I know that we all have a role here to play. And part of that role has to be what we teach our children, what we teach our grandchildren. I mean, I'm at the, my kids are grown, so now it's with grandkids. But how do I teach my grandkids how to interact with other people who are different than them ethnically, racially, if you want to use that? And look, it comes in, I've talked about, I have my grandson on my program before. It comes into conversations with the belief systems that other people have, and that sometimes feels like they want to impose that upon us. Well, how do we push back without trying to destroy their belief systems or attack their belief systems? Because this all fits into some of these tensions that exist between people that are different. Now, look, as we engage people directly, especially romantically, or build families with people of different cultures, that's a tension that has to be dealt with between two people. But as communities, we have to deal with it too. So, I mean, I again, this show is a show that I'm struggling with. I mean, I felt like I wanted to weigh in, not just because it's topical. I mean, this is a problem, because it's not enough to claim that you're not racist. If you're not actively trying to put some sort of end to the acceptability of racism, then you're not doing enough. I mean, if you're not doing what you can to stop racism, then you're probably allowing some of it to exist. I mean, and look, we see this playing out in some of the battles that I have over the mascot issue at various schools, including the school that I graduated from. We see this play out over and over and over again. So I guess if there's one thing that I want to say in this program, is we need to check ourselves. We need to check ourselves, and especially as we are influencing others around us, and our family members, our kids, our children, our grandchildren. Can we maintain cultural identity and our own distinction without putting other people down? Now, and I'm not saying that we don't recognize an attack or something that's offensive. I'm not saying that. But do we have to be the offending party? Are we the ones that have to put down somebody for their beliefs or for their skin color or for their nation of origin or whatever else? Yeah, I know. Look, we're quick to point out that if you're not native, you came here, you're an immigrant. But do we really? I mean, even as we say that has a different meaning when we're talking about somebody who's coming from Europe or Africa or Asia as an immigrant now, not being dragged here, than our own relatives that may be crossing, some artificial line drawn in the sand, like a Mexican border or a Canadian border, or any of the borders between across Turtle Island, North and South America. I mean, it's and even there we have some struggles. We have trouble identifying with other indigenous people simply because, why? Because they speak Spanish? Or because their colonizers were different than our colonizers? this is the tension. This is the tension, and this is what I'm saying. I hope that we can begin to check ourselves a little bit on this, because this is tough. This is tough because, if we view everything as dog eat dog, and we don't understand that we as Native people, if we're really going to claim our relationship with the environment, then we have to acknowledge that there are people who are different than us that are part of that environment. Not lesser than us, but different than us. We need to check that. We need to fight against racism, not just claim not to be racist. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.